Number 1.
August 22, 1987. On the outskirts of Melbourne, Australia, specifically in the suburban area of Lower Plenty, things are as they should be. While the rest of the world is beginning to cool down for fall, winter is coming to an end in Australia, so temperatures are still relatively chilly in this southern city. It is around 4 a.m. on a Saturday. The time where most families are at home, fast asleep. But on this chosen morning, an urban legend was beginning to take form, in the shape of a masked man lurking outside of a family home. Removing a pane from the family's living room window, this criminal made his way inside, alerting absolutely no one. This masked man made his way to the bedroom of the parents, armed with a knife and a gun. He woke up the two parents, under the threat of lethal retaliation, pretending to be just a common thief that was interested in their personal belongings. Commanding the parents to roll over onto their stomachs, this criminal tied both their hands and feet together, nullifying any plan of escape the two may have had in their tired, groggy, yet thoroughly alarmed state. This intruder utilized a type of knot commonly used by sailors or those with nautical experience. To further compound their inability to escape, the masked man ordered them into their nearby wardrobe, but not before blindfolding and gagging each with surgical tape that he had brought with him. He locked both parents in, under the threat of death, and made his way to the rest of the house. In an adjacent bedroom, the family's 6-year-old son was awoken by the intruder, but was kept relatively unharmed. The masked man blindfolded and gagged the boy with the same surgical tape, and then tied him to his own bed. This was when the intruder made his true purpose known, and he made his way into the nearby bedroom of the family's 11-year-old daughter. Over the next 2 hours, this masked intruder would take breaks from his own perverted sexual desires to wander throughout this family's home, even stopping at one point to make himself a meal. After spending the better part of 2 hours sexually assaulting this poor 11-year-old girl, this mysterious psychopath left the house with a box of classic records and a blue jacket stolen from the family. This is how the legend of Mr. Cruel began, and established an Australian boogeyman that would haunt parents and children for decades afterwards. Following the attack on the family in Lower Plenty, the police were obviously called and brought in to investigate the crime. Without a doubt, they were stumped. This attack seemed to come unprovoked, and the family had no real demons to look further into. The crime didn't seem to fit with any of the other open cases in the area. In the late 1980s, Melbourne had the reputation of being a safe place. The most live-able city in the world, many citizens ascribed as its unofficial slogan. While violent crime still happens within its borders, it is at a lower rate than many other places in the world. So, police began to look into the assault and pick apart the pieces. The parents had been bound, gagged, and then locked inside their own wardrobe. The son had been bound, gagged, blindfolded, and then tied to his bed. The daughter had been physically assaulted over the span of a couple of hours, in which the suspect searched the house and eventually made off with a record collection and randomly, a coat. More details came out when the investigators began to focus on the daughter, and she told the police that during one of the perpetrator's breaks, he had used the family phone to call someone else. This call was a threat, as apparently the man had demanded the person on the other end of the phone to move their children or else they would be next, and he referred to this person as Bozo. When the police checked the family's phone records, they were surprised to see that no such call had actually taken place. Obviously, this was before the commonplace nature of cell phones, but it became clear later on that this was a trend of Mr. Cruel. He liked to plant red herrings like this to confuse the investigators. Fortunately, it would be over a year before the perpetrator struck again. Unfortunately, we would see the stakes rise dramatically as this perverted individual began a reign of terror that would leave parents and children alike living in fear. December 27, 1988, just days after Christmas, most families would still be enjoying the post-holiday bliss. But on this day, one family would experience the most traumatic, haunting experience of their lives. John Wills, his wife, and his 4 daughters were sleeping in their Ringwood area home, just a few miles southeast of where the previous assault had taken place over a year prior. John was deep asleep when at around 5:45 in the morning, the sensation of an object to his temple startled him awake. "Don't be a hero," a voice ordered him, and John was immediately plunged into a parent's worst nightmare. This masked intruder, wearing dark blue overalls and a blue ski mask, was holding a gun to John's head. He was holding a knife in his other hand, and John knew that to fight back would be to risk the lives of his entire family. John and his wife were both ordered to roll onto their stomachs, much like the first crime, and they were bound at their wrists and ankles with copper wire. A similar type of knot was utilized as before, a specialized one used primarily by sailors. They were then blindfolded and gagged with the same type of surgical tape as before, and were then assured by the intruder that he was only there for money. The masked man stole roughly $35 from the family's bedside table, and he then went throughout the house, physically cutting the home's phone lines. After ensuring that he had a head start, he made his way into the bedroom that the family's 4 daughters shared. Addressing 10-year-old Sharon Wills by name, this man woke up the groggy 10-year-old girl and then proceeded to blindfold and gag her as he had her parents. He stopped to pick up a few items of her clothing and then made off with her into the early morning. It took roughly 15 minutes for the 2 parents to break free of the restraints, and when they finally did, they were confronted with the crippling realization that their oldest daughter was missing. With the phone lines cut, John had to rush next door to the neighbor's house to use their telephone, and he then proceeded to search the neighborhood in a panicked state. Unfortunately, his search would be in vain and come up with nothing. 10-year-old Sharon Wills was gone, and this family's nightmare had just begun. For over 18 hours, the Wills family existed in a panicked state, worrying that their 10-year-old daughter had been taken from them for good. It was just after midnight when a woman stumbled upon a small figure standing on a street corner. Wrapped up in green garbage bags, the small figure was Sharon Wills as she had been left by her abductor. Despite the terrible trauma that had just befallen her, the 10-year-old was in surprisingly strong spirits, calm and collected. "My name is Sharon Wills," she told the woman. "And I was taken from home early this morning. A man left me here and told me to go and ring home." The woman that found her called police and got in touch with the Wills family, and soon they were all reunited, but the investigation into the assault was just beginning. And it turned up some surprising evidence, or rather, the lack of any. Sharon was blindfolded throughout the entire ordeal, so she wasn't able to give a physical description of the attacker, but she described him as a soft-spoken, rather blunt individual that actually seemed somewhat caring about his victims. This of course stood in stark contrast to the egregious crimes that had just taken place, so investigators were sure to take a note of it. One of the words used to describe him was gentle, which was especially shocking. During her brief captivity, Sharon was apparently fed a Vegemite sandwich and given some milk and lemonade to drink. And shortly before being let go, the suspect had given the 10-year-old a thorough cleaning, not only washing off any possible forensic evidence he had left behind, but clipping her fingernails and toenails, brushing and flossing her teeth, and more. The abductor either kept or discarded her clothes, not wanting any forensic evidence to be traced back to him. He then dressed her in an assortment of garbage bags before dumping her off on the grounds of Baywater High School, just a few miles away from her house. Investigators were quick to piece this incident to the prior one in Lower Plenty, but they wouldn't make details of that public for quite some time. Needless to say, though, an environment of fear was beginning to take shape, and the nickname of the Hampton Rapist began to be used to describe this burgeoning boogeyman. In the weeks and months following the assault, the Wills family lived in a state of fear. The parents, along with their 4 daughters, began to sleep in the family's lounge together, refusing to sleep in separate bedrooms for months. They installed a security system and were even given a golden retriever as a pet by a caring individual. John Wills, in particular, took the assault very difficultly. He began to wonder if anything he might have done would have changed the course of the assault or saved his daughter all of that untold pain. He had no way to know and simply had to hedge his bets on the police, eventually finding his daughter's abductor. Unfortunately, the investigation into finding the perpetrator was a dead end. Very little evidence was left behind or ever found, and none of it could be used to find one specific person. One piece of evidence was emerged in later interviews, in which Sharon told of hearing low-flying aircraft during her short captivity. This is a clue that would go on to affect the investigation later on, for better or worse. While many in the area began to wonder who this masked menace was, another frightening question began to emerge. Who was next? Nearly 2 years would pass before that question would be answered. The area of Canterbury, Victoria, lies just on the outskirts of Melbourne. Located west of Ringwood and south of Lower Plenty, it is yet another part of this sprawling suburban area, albeit much closer to the centre of Melbourne proper. The Linus family were rather well-off English citizens who had been renting a house along the esteemed prestigious Monameath Avenue. For context, this neighbourhood had been home to many Australian politicians and public officials. Moving to Australia for business purposes, the family was prepared to move back to England in the very near future. In fact, they had moved to this Melbourne area community specifically to raise their children safely and were planning on making their move back home just days later. On July 3, 1990, their illusion of safety would be shattered forever. The Linus parents, Brian and Rosemary, were at a farewell party being thrown for them. The family was planning on moving back to England in the very near future, so they had left their 2 daughters alone at home for just a few hours. It was shortly before midnight when 15-year-old Fiona and 13-year-old Nicola were awoken by the angry, commanding barks of a masked intruder. He ordered Nicola into another room to collect her school uniform from the Presbyterian Ladies' College she attended, while he began to tie up Fiona in the very bed she had just been sleeping in. Armed with a gun and a knife, these 2 lone teenage girls stood no chance of either fight or flight. And now with the oldest of the 2 bound, this intruder was able to make his getaway quite easily. Informing Fiona that her father, Brian, would have to pay $25,000 for the safe return of Nicola, this abductor took her and made his escape in the family's own rental car, which was parked in the driveway. The 2 drove for about a kilometer, and then they proceeded to park the family's rental car and presumably transfer to another parked car that this abductor had prepared. It was just 20 minutes after the abduction that Brian and Rosemary Linus returned home, finding their driveway empty and their front door open. That intrigue turned into fear, which only compounded when they found poor 15-year-old Fiona bound on her own bed with a ransom message to share. The police found almost no evidence from the crime scene itself, the intruder's kidnapping of Nicola having been done in a quick tactical manner. They realized that tough spot that they were now put in, with most missing persons cases going cold just hours after the initial abduction. Unlike the abduction of Sharon Wills, Nicola wasn't returned later that day, or even the next day. Roughly 36 hours after the abduction, her father Brian held a press conference in which he pleaded with the abductor and stated his willingness to comply with the ransom demands in any way possible. Unfortunately, the Hampton rapist, as he was now known as, had left behind only a demand for money, but no means of which to collect. The investigation began to look into business dealings of Brian's, beginning to think that this may somehow be related to his work. The police believed, at the time, that this ransom must have been personal in nature. Fortunately for poor Nicola and her family, she was found alive approximately 50 hours after being abducted. It was her 14th birthday. Found outside an electricity station in Kew, just a short distance away from her home, Nicola was left by her abductor. Fully dressed and wrapped in a blanket, her abductor had left her outside the utility station and told her to sit in a prone position until he could drive away. After that, she had removed the blindfold that had become her vision for the entirety of her captivity and then made her way to a nearby house. It was shortly after 2 in the morning, but she immediately phoned her father, who had been awake praying for her safe return ever since returning to a desecrated home on July 3. Nicola was able to provide the investigators with some details that were vital to their investigation. Most prominent among them was a rough estimation of the perpetrator's height, which was roughly 175 centimeters, or 5'8", for those of us stateside. She had guessed this by judging her own height to the attacker when he rushed her from her bedroom to the getaway car and said that he barely stood taller than herself. She revealed information that the suspect likely had reddish-brown hair. Nicola was also able to give detectives some vital details they hadn't heard as of yet, a description of her abductor's house and vehicle. While the sketches she gave the police were rather mundane and plain in nature, They were of vital importance, especially once word of how she had gotten them got out. Apparently Nicola had been blindfolded for the duration of her captivity, but had been given a few chances to get a glimpse and take in it. This went in direct contrast to threats given to her by Mr. Cruel. "My freedom is worth more than your life," he had told Nicola, which echoed threats he had given to Sharon Wills. Just like Sharon Wills' captivity, Nicola had been bathed and cleaned before her release. Throughout her captivity, she had also been forced into a neck brace fastened to the abductor's bed, which no doubt fed into the fear and panic she must have felt throughout. During this endeavor, it was reported that the perpetrator talked aloud to another person while Nicola was blindfolded in a bedroom, but no response was ever heard. Investigators weren't sure whether this meant there was an accomplice or such, but it's likely that this was just one of his many red herrings. She also told investigators, months after the Linas family completed their move back home to their native England, that she remembered hearing the same type of low-flying aircraft previously reported by Sharon. To investigators, this meant that the suspect lived in the surrounding vicinity of the nearby Tullamarine Airport, most likely in its direct flight path. Now the investigators had the rough height of the suspect, as well as detailed sketches of his house, the interior of his car, and a good idea of where he lived. You'd assume that a warrant would be issued for an arrest any day now, but you'd be assuming wrong. Unfortunately, the worst was yet to come. John and Phyllis Chan were two incredibly hardworking parents that worked approximately 18 hours a day to ensure luxurious lives for their three daughters. Both immigrants to Australia, the two parents owned 3 restaurants in the Eltham area of Victoria, as well as a handful of other property investments. The two parents often didn't return home until midnight or so, managing one of their 3 restaurants. They would often leave their 3 daughters home alone, trusting their 13-year-old daughter Carmine to watch over the other 2. Mr. Cruel must have known this, as detectives believe he would stake out his victims for weeks or months ahead of time, learning their habits. On April 13, 1991, terror and tragedy would strike the Chan family in the form of Mr. Cruel himself. Even though the family resided in the comfortable Templestowe district of Victoria, in a house that many would classify as a mansion, they weren't immune to the dread of Mr. Cruel. It was a Saturday, normally a very busy day for the Chan parents. Carmine and her 2 younger sisters were left to their own devices, which on a Saturday night meant the 3 sisters would be watching movies and TV in Carmine's room. At roughly 8:40 in the evening, Carmine and one of her sisters started to go to the family's kitchen to make something to eat when they were confronted by Mr. Cruel, wearing his traditional balaclava along with a green great tracksuit and holding an intimidating knife. "I only want your money," Mr. Cruel told the 3 girls as he forced the 2 younger daughters into Carmine's closet. He claimed he only wanted Carmine to show him where the money was, and he braced a bed in front of the closet, locking in the 2 youngest sisters as he made his getaway with Carmine. Within minutes, the 2 youngest sisters had broken free from their makeshift prison and immediately placed a call to their father, hard at work at the family's restaurant. By the time police arrived, they knew what had taken place. The large house had no sign of children within, no yard toys, no playground equipment, or anything of the sort. This attack had been planned, and that was evident from the house's driveway. Written in big bold letters on Phyllis Chan's parked Toyota Camry were the words "Pay back, Asian drug dealer." More to come. Tracing his entrance from a cut window screen, police were able to track the intruder's steps through the house, including his getaway through the sliding glass door in the kitchen. Aided by tracking dogs, they were able to trace the abductor's steps through the family's garden and tennis court, up to nearly 300 meters away at a vacant lot, where he must have made his getaway with Carmine at a waiting car. Hoping to get their daughter returned home safely to them, both John and Phyllis Chan held a press conference roughly 72 hours later. Phyllis Chan broke down sobbing, holding up the outfit Carmine had been wearing the night she was taken, and pleading for her daughter to be returned home safely. Days later, the Chan family posted an encrypted letter in the local newspaper, using a cipher that Carmine would have been able to decipher. They offered ransom in exchange for the safe return of their daughter. Even Carmine's sisters penned letters to be published in the media, begging for their older sister to be returned to help take care of them and help with their homework. Unfortunately, days, weeks, and then months would pass with no word on Carmaine's safe return. And more unfortunately, the investigation was marred from the very beginning. The first police responders spoiled any potential evidence by failing to establish the Chan house as a crime scene. There were dozens of police walking throughout the house and looking for leads before investigators could begin to look for clues of their own. Even though the police force spent the next few months running a fine-toothed comb through John Chan's personal and professional life, looking for any possibility of criminal ties of business enemies, the investigation soon swung to focus on Mr. Cruel. The writing on the Chan's vehicle was nothing more than another red herring, meant solely to mislead investigators. One of the largest manhunts in Australian history, Operation Spectrum was a multi-million-dollar undertaking that consumed tens of thousands of man-hours, along with many thousands of more volunteer hours. Offering a $300,000 reward for any information leading to the capture of Mr. Cruel, the safe return of Carmaine Chan was of the utmost priority. However, there would be no happy ending for Carmaine or her family. Nearly a year to the day of Carmaine's abduction, on April 9, 1992, a man was walking his dog in the nearby area of Thomastown, along Edgar's Creek, when the pair stumbled upon a weird object. He bent down to touch it and was horrified by his discovery. Returning home to alert the authorities, the police soon discovered what the man had found: a fully decomposed skeleton, which would soon be revealed to have been Carmaine Chan. An autopsy would reveal that Carmaine had been shot 3 times in the head, execution style, and based on the decomposition of her skeleton, had likely been dead for close to a year. Theories have lingered as to why Mr. Cruel murdered Carmaine, but that can possibly be explained by Carmaine's own mother, Phyllis. Phyllis insists that Carmaine was a stubborn girl who would have fought against being victimized and likely learned of her abductor's identity. It's possible she learned who her kidnapper was and paid the ultimate price for it. Even though his life had been torn apart, John Chan was cleared of any possible wrongdoing and revealed to be an upstanding member of society. Operation Spectrum now publicly connected Carmaine Chan's murder to the 3 previous sexual assault kidnappings and laid the blame at the feet of the true culprit, the still unidentified Mr. Cruel. Operation Spectrum would last for the next few years, costing over $4 million. The 40-member task force would go on to investigate over 27,000 suspects, receive over 10,000 tips from the public, and search over 30,000 houses in the hopes of identifying a single clue. While Mr. Cruel was never identified by the task force, it went on to arrest over 70 people involved in child pornography, a seedy underworld that many believed Mr. Cruel to be involved in. Both of his freed abductees had claimed to have seen or heard clues of a camera at the foot of the bed they had been detained in, and it was an easy step to believe that Mr. Cruel was involved in the trading of child porn. But, unfortunately, despite all of the good accomplished by Operation Spectrum, the Victoria Police Force was marred with claims of corruption in the early 1990s, which not only would go on to affect the later investigations into Mr. Cruel, but bring forward many claims of a cover-up. Operation Spectrum was eventually shelved in 1994, and with it any potential leads for Mr. Cruel. Over the years, theories would linger about the identity of Mr. Cruel and his eventual fate. No future crimes would be attributed to him, but investigators have possibly tagged prior crimes on Mr. Cruel. While they believe that the abduction and murder of Carmaine Chan was his last offense in the Victoria area, there are potentially up to a dozen assaults on children in the mid-1980s that have remained unsolved. And almost all of them share a couple of details with the Mr. Cruel abductions. So it's possible that Mr. Cruel is far more notorious of a criminal than publicly known, but police have refused to release details of these prior assaults or Mr. Cruel's alleged ties to them. Another theory that has emerged has been Mr. Cruel's supposed ties to the Victoria school system. All 4 of the assaults and abductions happened during school breaks, which lead many to believe that Mr. Cruel was an employee of the local school system. This also goes in conjecture with the knowledge that both Nicola Linus and Carmaine Chan attended the same school, Presbyterian Ladies College, and Mr. Cruel requested Nicola to bring her school uniform along with her. This would bring into question his ties to Sharon Wills, since he addressed her by her name on the night she was abducted. Further interviews with his two living abductees revealed that he liked to refer to them as Missy and lived in a fantasy where he thought the two were married. It's very possible that this monster, a man that preyed on children in the most depraved ways, spent his working hours among them. In 2010, over 20 years after the original abductions and assaults, a new investigation was launched into finding out details and hopefully identifying this Australian boogeyman. Task Force Apollo was launched, hoping that newer technology and investigative methods could bring about an answer that prior detectives had failed to find. Unfortunately, much to the dismay of the task force itself, many of the case files were misfiled, unorganized, or just straight up missing. In fact, one of the vital pieces of evidence that could have led to Mr. Cruel's doorstep, a piece of tape used to bind one of the victims, was missing. Police could have potentially used that piece of tape to recover DNA from Mr. Cruel, but it had disappeared while in police custody. This missing piece of crucial evidence, paired with Mr. Cruel's tactical abilities and his knowledge of forensic evidence, has led many to theorize that he might have been involved in law enforcement. It's possible that he would know what investigators would be looking for, which is why he did his best to cleanse his victims of any DNA and remove vital evidence afterwards. We can only guess whether it was corruption or ineptitude that led to these essential parts of the case going missing. However, one suspect was detained in 2013 that ultimately could have been Mr. Cruel. Robert Keith Knight was a man who had made a living as a youth worker and school volunteer, but had been arrested on two separate occasions for a variety of crimes against children. In 1980 and 1996, Knight had been arrested and convicted for sexual assaults on minors, and a multitude of other victims had come out of the woodwork following his convictions. According to the original Operation Spectrum investigators, Robert Keith Knight was one of their suspects that had never quite panned out, but investigators had been unable to eliminate him from contention. He remained a person of interest throughout the following investigations, and the time of the Mr. Cruel assaults would coincide with his post-1980 conviction release. After being released from prison for his 1996 conviction in 2009, Knight began to amass thousands of child pornography images, and he was later detained in an investigation by Victorian police. He pleaded guilty to the overwhelming evidence, and while awaiting trial, he leaped from a second-story prison railing to his death by suicide. So he is just one of the many suspects that the Victorian police force have had to this day, and they have refused to make much more information public. More recently, many people have begun to theorize that Mr. Cruel himself might have resurfaced and been involved in the 2011 abduction of 13-year-old schoolgirl Bung Sirabun, as that case remains unsolved without an end in sight. As of this moment, the Mr. Cruel case is still open, and he remains one of Australia's most wanted criminals.
Number 2.
Essence Christal was only 21 years old when she was murdered on November 26, 2011. The young mother was shot during the early morning hours while she was driving on Broad Street in Providence, Rhode Island. There were two men in the car with Essence, one of them was said to be her boyfriend at the time. Essence and the two men were reportedly followed a dark-colored four-door car after leaving a store. Whoever was in that car eventually pulled up next to the car Essence was driving and began shooting. Essence then crashed the car into a tree, causing it to flip over. She was pronounced dead on the scene. The two men in the car with Essence were treated for minor injuries. The killer fled the scene after the brutal shooting and remains unidentified to this day. There has been very little information about Essence's case in the media. 4 years after Essence's death, in 2015, her mother Diana Garlington shed more light on the circumstances leading up to the murder. Diana told reporters that Essence's boyfriend, one of the men in the car with her on the night of her death, was allegedly abusive. He was also reportedly the target of another shooting just a week before Essence was shot. Diana also stated that this man forced Essence to leave with him on the night of her death. She explained, "The night it happened, he went to my sister's house where Essence was staying, he forced her into his car and took her to a store on Broad Street. I was told by a witness, the last account of what I heard was that an SUV started following them when Essence got behind the wheel of the car when they left. Then they started firing at the car, and she was the only one of the car who got shot. The police also told Essence's family members that there are other witnesses, but nobody has come forward. There are no known suspects or persons of interest in the case at this time, and Essence's murder remains unsolved. Her family is pleading for answers. If you have any information that could help solve Essence's case, please call 1-855-776-7100 to submit an anonymous tip.
Number 3.
Karen Swift, 44, went missing in Dyersburg, Tennessee on October 30, 2011. The previous evening, Karen attended a Halloween party at a country club but had left early to pick up one of her daughters from a sleepover. She then returned to her home where she lived with her 2 daughters and her husband, David Swift. Karen had recently filed for divorce from David, however the two still lived in the same house but in separate rooms. David stated that he saw Karen around midnight that night and then one last time the following morning. She has never been seen or heard from again after that. Karen's car was found abandoned later that day, just a short distance from her house. She was subsequently reported missing later that evening when she failed to return home. After initial investigations, a search party was formed for Karen on December 10, 2011. It was during that search that Karen's body was found underneath some leaves near Bledsoe Cemetery in Dyer County. Her death was classified as a homicide. David has been a person of interest in Karen's case since the get-go. Their marriage was obviously strained around the time of her disappearance, and he was also the last known person to have seen her. Despite this, David has never been arrested or charged with anything in relation to Karen's murder. For years, further details surrounding Karen's case remained a mystery. Her autopsy was sealed after it was performed, so the public knew very few details about her death. Karen's case finally got a fresh set of eyes in 2018 when a private investigator named Helen Michelle Cohen began to investigate the murder. HMC's investigation finally revealed Karen's cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head. It was noted that Karen had significant injuries to her frontal and temporal lobes, which suggests that she was facing her attacker at the time she was struck. HMC's investigation revealed many other previously unknown details about the case as well. These details have led to numerous new theories about Karen's murder. In October 2011, it was well known that Karen was separated from her husband David. However, Karen might have been involved in a contentious situation with a few other people before her death as well. There were rumors that Karen had been in a relationship with a married couple. HMC spoke a close friend of Karen's in 2018, who confirmed these rumors. The friend reportedly also stated that Karen had confided that she was involved in something that she wasn't proud of. It was later learned that the couple Karen was involved with had been giving her money. Employees at the country club where the Halloween party was held also confirmed that Karen had been involved in an altercation with more than one woman, that evening one of those women being the daughter of a man who HMC refers to as prominent man, who is suspected to be the owner of the country club. After Karen vanished, 3 separate witnesses reported seeing prominent man with a metal detector in the area where Karen's body was later found. Despite this new information, David Swift still remains a person of interest in the case. Still, nobody else in the case has been ruled out, either. Many people now believe there is a possibility that the aforementioned individuals might have information about her death. Karen's murder investigation remains open. If you have any information that could help the investigation, please contact the Dyer County Sheriff's Office at 731-285-2802.
Number 4.
30-year-old Latasha Nevitt's mother, Brenda Morgan, always found it hard to believe that her daughter would simply walk away from her 3 children, then 10-year-old Ariel and 2-year-old twins, Brian and Ryan. Similarly, Latasha's father, James Morgan, remained puzzled about his daughter's disappearance, commenting that she always kept in touch and it was unlike her not to communicate with her family. So the news in March 2014 confirmed their worst fears when their daughter's body was discovered in a sewer drain. A dental technology student at Everest College, Latasha was last seen walking to a convenience store 5 blocks from her home in the 1300 block of West 107th Street in Chicago, Illinois on October 10, 2011. Latasha's husband, Isaac Nevitt, is believed to be the last person to see her before she disappeared. At the time, police searched the area and used a cadaver dog at the house where Latasha lived with Isaac but found nothing. I did not find much discussion of the investigation into Isaac in the sources I found, but I presume he was questioned as part of a standard procedure. I found no further updates until March 2014, when Latasha's body was discovered. On March 5, 2014, a Chicago Water Department employee, checking for a leak in a drain pipe in the 10,700 block of South Loomis Street, discovered a body wrapped in a plastic bag in a sewer drain. The body was later determined to be Latasha's, and the sewer drain, where her body was found, was less than 100 feet away from her home. A 2014 news article reported that Isaac questioned why the body was not found previously when they had cadaver dogs in the area. He also discussed his dismay over his neighbors looking at him crazy because Latasha's body was found on the block where they lived. He recalled, "Everybody looked on me as a criminal back then, so now they're really looking at me crazy." The Cook County Medical Examiner's Office released a statement stating that Latasha's body was found in a fetal position. A scarf was wrapped around her eyes like a blindfold, and her legs were bound with a cell phone charging cord. The coroner classified Latasha's death as a homicide by unspecified means. According to Brenda, Latasha's body was cremated, and there was no funeral, as to spare her grandchildren further pain. It was noted that Isaac's presence at Latasha's memorial caused some tension, as some family and friends believe he was involved in Latasha's death. Latasha's family honors her memory each year by releasing balloons at the corner where her body was found. They remain hopeful that someone will come forward saying, "You know who you are, and you know what you did. It's time to come clean." To this day, no arrests have been made in Latasha's case. Many still believe that her husband is responsible for her murder. However, police have not publicly announced Isaac or anybody as a suspect at this time. Latasha's family is desperately hoping to receive justice in this case. If you have any information that could help the investigation, please contact the Chicago Police Department.
Number 5.
A quaint apartment in Lewiston, Maine, still holds secrets that remain unrevealed to this day. Samantha Folsom's death was ruled undetermined despite her body being found stuffed in a closet and her apartment set up to destroy forensic evidence. A year after she was found by her parents, the police classified her death as a homicide, but her official cause of death has never been released to the public. Samantha Folsom was a wonderful daughter, student, and mother. In high school, she was captain of the junior varsity cheerleaders, a swimmer, a soccer player, and above all else, loved spending time with Jonathan, her older brother. When he attended Boy Scout events, Sam would insist on going with him. She had a strong love for animals, owned many cats, and was always an advocate for the underdog. Sam was the light of her parents' life. Difficulties in her life began when she met her soon-to-be husband, Jesse Folsom. Samantha's mother, Jolyn Turner, had a bad feeling about him from the start. Jolyn became concerned that Sam was a victim of domestic violence when she started noticing bruising on her daughter's arms. She suspected Jesse was responsible, but Sam denied any abuse going on in their relationship. In spite of their suspicions, Samantha's parents tried their best to accept the man their daughter loved into the family. They began searching for ways to help Jesse improve the path he was on in life, and in turn, improving hers. Sam's father, John David Turner, spent evenings working with Jesse to earn his GED and get recruited into the Army. Following their marriage on the 29th of December, 2005, Sam and Jesse moved to California, where he was to be stationed. That's when Samantha's demeanor seemed to change. Her mother noticed that she was always tired and started participating less in the activities she once enjoyed. Jolyn's instincts told her that Jesse and Sam may be involved in drugs, and her daughter eventually confessed to this. Even though Sam was trying her best to quit, it was a struggle for her. During a visit to her parents in Maine, Samantha started experiencing immense pain in her abdomen. She was immediately taken to the hospital where an ultrasound revealed that she was pregnant. Samantha and Jesse were both excited to have a baby on the way. In June of 2008, Sam gave birth to a beautiful baby boy they named Darren. Unfortunately, the bliss of family life soon wore off. Jesse wanted to move back to Maine and, although she went with him, Sam was not happy about the decision as she preferred living in California. The couple returned to Maine, where Sam got her own apartment as their major marital issues were only growing. She and Jesse agreed to split up. Once she was settled, Sam told her parents she wanted to go to rehab and clean up her life for her son. Her addiction was too much for her to quit on her own, and she knew she needed help. Her parents took custody of Darren in order to give Sam time to work on herself. Her hope was to go to rehab with the long-term goal of gaining custody of her son once again. On November 6, 2011, Samantha placed Darren in the care of a close relative and agreed to let her parents take her to rehab the next day. She never showed up. Samantha stopped answering phone calls. When they could not get a hold of her on the phone, John and Jolyn rushed to her apartment, only to be met with a locked door and no answer when they knocked. John asked the apartment manager to let them in to do a welfare check on their daughter, but they were denied entry as they were not listed on the lease. Her parents then filed a missing persons report with the police department and waited helplessly to hear anything from Sam. After 3 excruciatingly long days, they begged the apartment manager to let them into Sam's place so they could at least feed her cat who had not eaten in recent days. When they entered, the apartment was bitterly cold. Something was off. Although it was a chilly November in Maine, Samantha's parents found several fans running, and the windows in her apartment were wide open. The TV was also on, and the volume was all the way up. Something was off. Jolyn diverted her attention from the odd atmosphere to the well-being of Sam's cat. Knowing that the cat carrier was usually stored in the closet, she opened the door to retrieve it, never expecting to find her daughter's lifeless body curled up on the floor. November 9, 2011, altered the Turners' lives forever. Mere days after being reported missing, Samantha Folsom, 26, was found dead and cold, concealed in the closet of her own apartment. An investigation was swiftly launched into who had killed her. It was obvious that she had been murdered, although her cause of death was not immediately known. Police initially suspected Jesse, her estranged husband. It hadn't been long since they split up and Sam had started dating someone new. Could Jesse have murdered Sam in a jealous rage? This was impossible, however, as he was in jail at the time of the murder for assaulting Sam's new boyfriend. Investigators turned their attention to Sam's newest love interest. They had broken up shortly before her death, but Jolyn believed this guy had been abusive to her daughter during their relationship. Did Sam's ex-boyfriend have a motive for killing her? Police ruled him out as well when he, too, was found to be in jail at the time of her death and couldn't have possibly been the killer. It is unclear if there are any additional suspects in this case as the investigation into Sam's death is still considered ongoing and many details are being withheld. A reporter for the Portland Press-Herald, Scott Dolan, interviewed the neighbor living next door to Samantha. The neighbor told him that detectives had shown her a picture of a well-dressed man with a darker skin tone and wearing what looked like an ID badge. They asked her if she recognized who he was. She also told Dolan that someone had been knocking on Sam's door just a few days before her murder and Sam seemed terrified of them. This person has never been identified. Samantha's parents divorced after the stress and grief were too much for their marriage to withstand. They are still on good terms and share a sense of hope that one day their daughter's killer will be caught and brought to justice. Samantha's case is at risk of going cold. If you have any information on the murder of Samantha Folsom, please contact the Maine State Police at 207-657-3030.
Number 6.
The murder of UNC college student Faith Hedgepeth remains one of the most baffling unsolved murder cases in North Carolina. It's been nearly 9 years since 19-year-old Hedgepeth was found beaten to death in the off-campus Durham Chapel Hill apartment she shared with another student. Police collected tons of forensic evidence from the scene, including the murder weapon and DNA, performed hundreds of DNA tests, and even generated a composite image of the killer based on DNA. And yet, No arrests have ever been made. Here's a look at the case and where it stands in 2021, with information gathered from published reports in the News and Observer and the Durham Herald Sun, and from reports from ABC News, NBC News and other linked sources. Hedgepeth grew up in Hollister, North Carolina, a small community on the Warren-Halifax County border. She was a member of the Haliwa-Saponi tribal community. Her parents are Roland and Connie Hedgepeth. An older sister, Rolanda Hedgepeth, was 18 when Faith was born and was like a second mother to her. Hedgepeth was a sophomore at UNC Chapel Hill when she was killed. She was at UNC on a Gates Millennium Scholarship for advanced minority students, but also worked part-time jobs for grocery and gas money. At the time she died, she was employed at the Red Robin restaurant near the Durham border. Her dream was to become a pediatrician, and then she and her friend Gabrielle Evans would return to their community and have medical careers there. There is now a Faith Hedgepeth Memorial Scholarship Fund, which helps Native American women from a North Carolina tribe earn a higher education. On Thursday, September 6, 2012, the day before Hedgepeth was killed, she attended a rush event for Alpha Pi Omega around 6 p.m., according to police, and then went to Davis Library on the UNC campus with her friend and roommate, Karina Rosario. Hedgepeth and Rosario returned home around 7:30 p.m. Rosario lived at the Hawthorne at the View apartment complex on Old Chapel Hill Road near the Durham-Chapel Hill border, later renamed Preserve at the park, and was letting Hedgepeth stay with her until Hedgepeth could move into her own apartment later that month. The women left the apartment after midnight on September 7 and went to a Chapel Hill nightclub on Rosemary Street called The Thrill. Surveillance footage shows them arriving at 12:40 a.m. Rosario told police that they left because she wasn't feeling well, and the two are seen on surveillance footage leaving the club at 2:06 a.m. They returned to Rosario's apartment. Around 4:25 a.m. Rosario told police that she left the apartment, picked up by a male friend, leaving Hedgepeth home alone and asleep in the bedroom. Rosario told police that she left the door unlocked. Rosario got a ride back to her apartment with a friend, Marisol Rangel, and they arrived around 11 a.m. They discovered Hedgepeth on the bed with blood under her head. Rosario called 911 at 11:01 a.m. She told the dispatcher that her roommate was unconscious and that there was blood everywhere. The dispatcher repeatedly asked her to check to see if Hedgepeth was breathing so that Rosario could possibly give her aid, and Rosario said she did not want to touch her. When Rosario told the dispatcher that Hedgepeth felt cold to the touch, the dispatcher advised her to leave the body and not to touch anything. When police arrived, they found Faith's body hanging off the bed, face up, wearing only a black shirt that was pulled up over her head, according to a search warrant released in 2014. According to an autopsy report released to the public in September 2014, Hedgepeth's head was bludgeoned so severely that medical examiners concluded her cause of death to be blunt force trauma. The report also detailed cuts and bruises on her arms and legs and blood under her fingernails. In addition to the blood pooled underneath Hedgepeth's head, blood had also spattered on the wall and closet door. Police told ABC News in 2016 that it is more likely than not that Hedgepeth was raped. Police believe a Bacardi peach rum bottle normally kept in the kitchen is the murder weapon. The bottle had tissue fragments and DNA on it. In addition to blood and tissue evidence, police collected semen from Hedgepeth's body. Police also found a white, time-out fast food bag on the bed with the handwritten words, "I'm not stupid bitch and jealous." Unlike other pieces of evidence in the room, the bag did not have blood on it. Later, a friend would turn over a bizarre voicemail message from Hedgepeth that appeared to be an accidental pocket dial from the night she was killed. The message was hard to understand, but has been analyzed by experts, some of whom believe it captures moments from the assault. The Chapel Hill police said they do not consider the voicemail to be from the time of the assault. The Chapel Hill Police Department has conducted thousands of interviews and performed hundreds of DNA tests based on forensics found at the scene of the murder, but have not found a match. The search warrants released in September 2014 indicate that police initially looked closely at several men in connection with the case, two of them former boyfriends of Rosario, but none matched the DNA found at the scene. In 2016, Police released a computer-generated composite of the possible killer, created by Parabone Nanolabs based on DNA evidence at the scene. The DNA phenotyping indicates the man is likely Latino with dark olive to light olive skin tone, brown or hazel eyes and black hair. Police say the composite sketch does not rule out that others may have been involved. TV shows and podcasts about Faith Hedgepeth. There have been numerous television shows and podcasts about Hedgepeth's case. Here are some of the major ones. Superscript A. In 2016, the TV news magazine 2020th aired a special episode on the case called 2020's Love, Hope, and Faith, the Faith Hedgepeth murder. The special includes interviews with family and friends, including Marisol Rangel. The Chapel Hill Police Department cooperated with ABC for this special, revealing here for the first time the Parabone composite and a photo of the murder weapon. The special is available online in several parts, Parts 1 and 2, Part 3, Part 4, Part 5 and Part 6. Superscript A. In 2018, the investigation discovery series Breaking Homicide looked into Hedgepeth's murder. For the episode, former Rhode Island Police Sergeant Derek Levasseur and forensic psychologist Chris Mahandy spend time in Chapel Hill talking to police, Hedgepeth's parents, Marisol Rangel, Faith's former boyfriend, Michael Ty McNeil, and others close to the case. They consult with specialists who analyze the handwriting on the note left at the scene and the 911 call placed by Rosario. They believe Rosario is the key to solving the case. Investigation discovery shows are usually available to stream on Discovery+. Superscript A. In 2019, newspaper columnist Tom Gasparoli releases a 10-episode podcast series about the Hedgepeth murder called Pursuit. On the podcast, Gasparoli asks retired Raleigh homicide detective Chris Morgan to give his opinions about the 911 call and the case. Morgan says he believes the note on the fast food note was staged by the killer to throw off investigators. Superscript A. An investigation discovery special called Who Killed the Co-ed? An ID murder mystery aired in May 2020. The special features interviews with Hedgepeth's parents and friends and with members of the Chapel Hill Police Department. It also features some fairly gruesome reenactments of the crime scene. Investigation discovery shows are usually available to stream on Discovery+. Superscript A. In October 2020, the popular true crime podcast Crime Junkie featured Faith Hedgepeth's case. Anyone with information about Faith Hedgepeth's case should contact the Chapel Hill Police Department at 919-614-6363 or the Chapel Hill Crime Stoppers at 919-942-7515.
Number 7.
Hannah Truelove lived with her mother at Lake Lanier Club Apartments, a gated complex located in Gainesville, Georgia. The day Hannah posted the above selfie, she also tweeted, "I need to move out of these dang apartments." The following day, she was seen hanging out with some of her fellow teenage friends who lived in the same complex. Hannah was last seen sitting at the neighborhood picnic tables with her friends around 7:30 p.m. She never returned home as planned. By 10 p.m., after her mother was unable to locate or contact her, Hannah was reported missing. Around 24 hours later, a man taking a walk through the woods near the apartment complex spotted Hannah's body buried under leaves. She had been brutally stabbed multiple times. The case was immediately shifted to a homicide investigation. Initially, it appeared that investigators had many leads to work with. Hannah's father told police that somebody who rode the same school bus as her could have harmed her. Hannah apparently would often be apprehensive of going to school because she feared riding the school bus. Her father believed that a person on the bus might have threatened her in the past. Many believed Hannah's Twitter account provided potential clues as well. On August 12, 2012, Hannah tweeted, "I got me an ugliest stalker." 6 days later, on August 18, she tweeted, "So scared right now and every time we talk, I feel sick." 5 days later, Hannah was murdered. It is unclear who those tweets were directed towards, but they led many to believe that Hannah might have been murdered by the stalker she had referenced on the 12th. However, according to Hall County Sheriff Sergeant Dan Franklin, the tweets are likely not related to Hannah's murder. In a news story covering Hannah's case from 2016, Franklin told reporters all that stuff was investigated and looked into, and it was more just teenage drama type stuff. Another potential lead came from a sighting of a man in a small silver four-door car at the apartment complex the evening Hannah disappeared. This man still remains unidentified to this day, but investigators believe that he could be connected to the crime. Police are urging anyone who might have seen this man on August 23, 2012, to come forward with any potential information.